A mail-order bride waited in the cold with her children. What he said at sunrise changed everything. Winter had a way of quieting even the loudest kinds of hope. The train yard at Birch Hollow lay under a thin sheath of frost, each plank of the platform groaning softly as the cold tightened its grip. Dawn had not yet broken. The world was still blue. Breath came out in small clouds that disappeared too quickly, and the wind blew in short, sharp bursts that felt almost personal. Maren stood near the far end of the platform, her 2 children pressed close to her legs. The boy, Tomas, 10 years old but thin as a reed, rubbed his hands together in quick, desperate circles. The little girl, Elsie, barely 5, hid her face in Maren's skirt, trying to disappear into a mother whose warmth had run thin over too many miles. They had been waiting for a man they had never met, a man who had paid for her passage, a man who had written only 3 letters, a man who had, in his final envelope, added 5 words that had sealed everything. I will take all of you. A promise too large for coin, too soft for this cold. Maren lifted her eyes across the snowy horizon. Pine forests covered the hills like dark, sleeping animals. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Somewhere on the other side of that whiteness, a small homestead waited for a woman he had never seen, and children he had not asked about, yet accepted anyway. The last train had wheezed away an hour before. No one else remained on the platform, no passengers, no station master, just the 3 of them standing in the winter quiet like a family carved from ice. Tomas tugged at her sleeve. "Ma, maybe he changed his mind." His voice had that forced bravery boys use to keep from sounding afraid. Maren lowered her hand to his shoulder. "He'll come," she whispered. Men who change their minds don't write letters every week. But there was doubt even in her own breath. A gust of wind came slicing across the yard. The children pressed closer. Maren wrapped her thin shawl around all 3 of them, though the fabric felt more like paper now, stiff and brittle. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago. She blinked to keep the cold tears from forming, the ones that came not from sadness, but from wind. Then, far off, she heard it, the slow crunch of boots on snow, not hurried, not uncertain, just steady. The way a man walks toward something he has already decided he will not run from. Maren turned. A figure appeared between the row of telegraph poles, shoulders broad beneath a wool coat, hat pulled low against the cold, a scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face, a satchel swung at his side. Frost brushed the tips of his beard like ash from a long night. He walked closer, and with each step her heart rose and fell, unsure which direction to settle in. He stopped a few feet from them. For a moment, no one spoke. Only winter moved, a slow breath slipping around them all. He pulled the scarf down from his face. He was younger than she expected, or maybe just less hardened. His eyes were the color of river stones, gray with a hint of something warmer buried beneath. His voice, when it came, was soft enough to feel like the beginning of thaw. "You must be Maren." She nodded, unable to bring sound from her throat. "And these?" He looked down at the children, but not with calculation, not with burden. He studied them the way someone studies 2 small travelers who carried more weight than their size should allow. "Are Tomas and Elsie?" The children pressed closer to her. The man lowered himself onto one knee so he wouldn't loom. The boards creaked beneath him. "I'm Jonah Hale," he said. "You came a long way." Tomas swallowed. You really wanted us to?" Jonah looked the boy full in the face, not over him, not around him, and nodded once. "I did." Maren felt her breath crack in her chest. Jonah rose slowly, brushing frost from his gloves. He looked at Maren then, not with pity, not with judgment, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who had known lonely winters himself. "I'm sorry I wasn't here when your train came," he said. "The snow on the ridge was thicker than I planned. I had to walk the last mile." "That's all right," she murmured, her voice finally returning. "We weren't going anywhere." A small smile touched his lips, the kind that comes from truth, not politeness. Jonah looked toward the horizon. "Sun's about to come up," he said softly. "We should head out before the worst winds start again." My horse is tied by the bend. I thought I'd help you carry what's yours. But Marin had only one bag. The children had none. Their whole life fit into a sack hardly bigger than a pillow. Jonah seemed to understand without asking. He took a step closer, his breath warming the air between them. "Marin," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear. "You don't owe me anything. Not your fear, not your thanks, not your trust. When we walk from this station, it's because you choose to, not because I paid for a ticket." The sunrise pushed over the tree line just then, spilling pale gold across the snow and touching their faces with its first fragile heat. Her breath caught, because in that small light, something in Jonah's eyes shifted, from resolve to something softer, something almost like hope. And what he said next, in that early, trembling glow, would change everything. The light shifted across the platform, turning frost into a field of tiny burning stars. Jonah didn't move at first. He watched the sunrise the way a man watches something he hasn't seen in years, with a stillness that carried its own weather. Then he turned to her, voice barely above a whisper, breath turning gold in the morning air. "Marin, no one should begin a new life in the cold." The words weren't poetic, they weren't meant to impress. They were simply true, the kind of truth winter forces from a man when he's been stripped of everything else. Something inside her chest loosened, just slightly. Jonah adjusted the strap of his satchel. "My cabin's a good ways off. The trail's slow. We'll move at your pace." Marin nodded once, steadying Elsie's small hand in hers. Tomas retrieved the worn bag with both arms. They followed Jonah as he led them off the platform and onto the narrow path cutting through the thin layer of snow. The world was waking slowly. Crows lifted from the trees, their wings cracking through the cold air. The sky deepened from pale yellow to faint rose. Frost snapped beneath their boots in small breaking sounds that echoed like brittle glass. Jonah walked ahead, but not far, always close enough to turn around at the slightest hesitation. "You got injured?" Tomas asked suddenly, pointing at the awkward way Jonah's coat hung around one shoulder. Jonah glanced back. "No, son, just old bones from chopping logs before sunup." The sun hung in the air gently. Tomas blinked, unsure how to carry that word. Marin saw it. The way her boy swallowed hard like warmth was something he'd forgotten how to receive. They reached Jonah's horse tied beneath a bare ash tree. The animal stamped against the cold, but its ears twitched forward as they approached. "This is Birch," Jonah said. "Strong, stubborn, and better company than most men in town." Elsie peeked out from behind Marin's skirt. Jonah lowered himself again so he was eye level with the child. "You want to pet her muzzle?" he offered softly. Elsie's mittened hand trembled. She didn't speak, but she reached out. Birch lowered her head willingly, and the girl touched the horse's nose with a feather-light press. For the first time that morning, a small warmth flickered through Elsie's eyes. Jonah exhaled like the world had given him permission to breathe. He lifted Marin's bag carefully, as if it were heavier than the life inside it, and strapped it to the saddle. "Cabin's about 2 hours," he said, "but the ridge is slick, so we'll take the long path." Marin nodded again, grateful for the way he explained without commanding. They started forward, snow beginning to fall in slow, drifting flakes that seemed to forget how to hurry. Jonah walked beside Marin now, close, but never crowding. After a long silence, he spoke quietly. "There's a stove at the cabin, firewood stacked high. I made sure of it this time." "This time?" she echoed. Jonah stopped walking, just for a breath. He looked out toward the ridge, as if searching memory, not landscape. "Last winter," he said, voice tightening. "I didn't keep up with the chopping. Didn't think I needed much." He paused. "Turns out I was wrong." Marin sensed something in the quiet that followed. A ghost that winter had left behind. But she didn't press. As they walked again, the snowfall thickened. Flakes clung to the children's hats, to Jonah's beard, to Marin's lashes. Her breath fogged and drifted, like smoke rising from something still smoldering inside. The trail narrowed into a slope of packed snow. Jonah turned to Tomas. "If you get tired, I'll lift you onto Birch." "I won't get tired," Tomas muttered quickly. Jonah's lips twitched. Didn't say you would, just giving you the option. Tomas walked a little taller after that. They reached a bend in the trail where the land dropped into a frozen creek. The ice shone silver blue beneath the new sun. Marin slowed. Jonah noticed instantly. "We can rest," he said. "No," she whispered. The cold makes my chest tight sometimes." Jonah studied her, but not with prying, with recognition. "You learn that kind of breathing on long roads," he murmured. "I had it once too." Elsie tugged at Marin's sleeve. "Is your home warm?" Jonah's answer came quick, steady, sure. "Yes," he said, "warm enough that your fingers won't hurt anymore." The wind shifted, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the distant creak of something wooden, maybe a fence, maybe a barn door, maybe just winter speaking in its own language. They walked again. Bird tracks stitched the snow like scattered writing. The sky brightened, though the cold still pressed close to their skin. Jonah finally spoke again, but this time it was something heavier. "Marin, there's something I should tell you before we reach the cabin. Something about the letters I sent." She stiffened slightly, not with fear, with the familiar bracing of someone who had learned to expect the other shoe to fall. Jonah kept walking, his boots crunching slow and steady across the snow. "The thing is," he said quietly, "I didn't tell you everything about why I chose this, why I asked for a wife, why I wrote back the moment I read your name." Marin felt her breath hitch. Tomas lifted his head. Elsie blinked up at Jonah with wide winter eyes. The wind fell silent. Jonah's voice, when it came, was soft, raw, like something finally breaking free. "It wasn't loneliness," he said. "It wasn't need." He turned to her fully then, eyes steady in the morning light. "It was because someone once waited for me in the cold, and I didn't get there in time." The snow kept falling, and nothing in the world felt still anymore. The world around them seemed to absorb Jonah's words, muffling the forest into a quiet too deep for morning. Snowflakes drifted sideways in the sudden stillness, twisting like they'd been startled mid-fall. Marin didn't speak. She didn't breathe for a moment. Jonah kept his gaze on the tree line ahead, not on her, as if the truth he'd just released was something he couldn't look at directly yet. "She was my sister," he said finally. "Hester. Younger than me, quick laugh, quicker heart." He swallowed once, slow. "A winter storm pinned me up in the mountains. I thought I'd be back before sunset. I wasn't." His breath clouded in a long exhale. "That night, she waited outside the cabin door for me. I don't know why. Maybe she thought she'd hear my boots first in the snow. Maybe she didn't want to fall asleep until she knew I was safe." Marin's hand tightened around Elsie's mitten. Jonah's voice softened into something rougher. "When I got home, the lantern she'd taken outside had burned down to glass. She was lying just beside it. The wind pressed through the trees like an old sorrow learning how to move again." Tomas looked up at Jonah, eyes wide but respectful in the way boys learn to be when they hear a man speaking through old hurt. "She didn't die right away," Jonah added. "She held on, long enough to say she knew I'd come home, long enough to ask me not to blame the world." He cleared his throat, but his voice was still quiet when he continued. "Since then, I can't stand the thought of anyone waiting in the cold. Not for me. Not for anyone." The path narrowed, forcing them to walk single file. Snow gathered thick on the slope now, turning each step into a careful push. Marin walked behind Jonah, her breath uneven, not from the climb, but from the weight of his confession settling into her chest. Not heavy, just true in a way she understood too well, because she knew what it meant to lose someone to the cold. She knew the ways winter could steal breath and memory without a sound. They kept walking until the trees thinned and the ridge opened into a clearing. Below them sat a small cabin hugged by snowdrifts and a quiet plume of smoke curling from the chimney. A fence circled the yard crookedly, more for familiarity than protection. Jonah paused at the top of the hill. "That's home," he said softly. Marin stared down at the little cabin. The roof bowed under the weight of snow. Icicles hung from the eaves like glass knives, but smoke, real, bright, warm smoke, rose steady from the chimney, and something inside her chest eased in a way she hadn't expected. It looked like a place where life could start again, not perfectly, but honestly. Tomas whispered, "It's small." Jonah nodded. "Small stays warm longer." Elsie peeked out from behind Marin's skirt, leaning forward to see. "Will we sleep inside?" "You'll sleep where the fire can reach your toes," Jonah said, voice softening. "That's a promise." They made the slow descent into the clearing. The snow thickened as the wind picked up again, and Jonah moved closer to Marin, not touching, but near enough that she felt shielded. When they reached the cabin steps, Jonah brushed the snow off the railing with his sleeve. "Marin," he said quietly, turning to her before they entered, "before we step inside, I want to say something plain." She lifted her eyes to him. His voice came low, steady, touched with a kind of resolve she recognized, the kind a man uses when he knows winter has no mercy and he must make some for himself. "When I wrote those letters," Jonah said, "I promised you safety, a roof, a fire, a name to stand beside, but I didn't promise love. I didn't think I had enough left to give." Snow gathered on his shoulders, his hat brim, his beard. "But this morning, seeing you three on that platform," he breathed deeply, "something in me thought I thought was gone for good." Marin felt the words enter her chest like the warmth from an open door. Jonah gently lifted the latch. The door gave a long groan as it swung inward. Heat spilled out immediately, the thick, rich breath of a fire that had been burning since before dawn. Inside, the room glowed with amber light. Logs crackled. A pot steamed gently atop the stove. The scent of pine resin and herbs filled the air. A rug lay before the hearth. 2 handmade wooden chairs stood beside a table with a chipped blue mug waiting on it. The cabin didn't look lonely. It looked lived in, tended, prepared. Jonah stepped aside. "Go on, warm yourselves." Tomas hurried inside first, the heat nearly knocking the cold off his coat. Elsie followed, eyes wide as she held her palms out toward the fire. Marin stood at the doorway a moment longer, the threshold holding her still, like it was a question she wasn't sure she was allowed to answer. Jonah watched her gently. "You're home now," he said, "not command, not claim, just truth." She stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a memory she didn't know she still carried. Her knees weakened, but she steadied herself on the back of a chair. Jonah shut the door behind them, sealing out the wind. For the first time in many months, Marin felt warmth deep enough to reach bone, but winter had not finished testing them, because as Jonah unwrapped his scarf and brushed snow from his shoulders, a distant sound drifted through the trees outside. A sound faint, hollow, and unmistakable. Wagon wheels, many of them, approaching through the snow. Jonah didn't move at first. The sound drifted faintly through the trees, uneven, clattering, something heavy dragging across frozen ground. Not the soft rhythm of a single traveler, not the hurried rattle of a neighbor's cart. This was slower, heavier, a caravan pushing through winter. Tomas looked up from the fire, his small face paling. Are they coming here?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "Maybe just passing by." But Marin saw the flicker behind his eyes, the same flicker she'd seen in men who had learned danger by heart. He crossed to the window quickly, brushing aside the burlap curtain. His breath fogged the glass as he stared into the forest beyond the yard. The snow muffled everything except the distant groan of wooden wheels forcing their way through half-frozen ruts. Marin stepped closer, her voice low. "Jonah, who would come this far in winter?" "A group that needs something," he murmured. "Or a group that thinks it can take something." The fire crackled sharply behind them, throwing sparks against the grate. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Marin understood. Danger does not ride alone. Jonah turned toward her then, not with fear, but with the quiet, controlled breath of a man calculating every window, every path, every second. He reached for his coat. "I'll go out and see who they are." "No," Marin spoke before she realized the word had left her mouth. The warmth of the cabin, the fragile peace still settling inside it. She couldn't watch him walk into the cold alone, not after what he'd just told her. Jonah softened, just slightly. I won't be far. Stay by the fire. Tomas rose to his feet. I can help. You stay with your mother. Jonah's voice was gentle but final. Fire warm? Good. Keep it that way. Elsie crawled onto Marin's lap, trembling, though she did not cry. She buried her face in her mother's shawl, fingers clenching tightly. Jonah opened the door a crack. Wind surged in, cold enough to sting. Snow swept across the floor in a thin veil. Marin, he said softly, not turning back yet. No matter what happens, I'm not letting anything take you from this house. She felt the words more than heard them. Then he stepped out, pulling the door closed behind him with a low thud. The warmth inside dimmed without him. Outside, his boots sank into the snow with a soft crunch. The wind caught his coat, whipping it sideways as he strode toward the tree line. Birch, the horse, snorted anxiously in the yard, shifting from leg to leg, sensing the weight in the air. The sound of wagon wheels came clearer now, creaking, complaining, grinding over frozen earth. Jonah reached the fence and rested a gloved hand on the top rail, eyes fixed on the shadows between the pines. Marin hovered near the door, unable to sit, unable to breathe fully. The children stayed close to the fire, but their eyes were fixed on her, waiting for her reaction, her strength. The sky began to dim, clouds crawling across the sun until the clearing returned to its cold blue shade. Finally, Jonah saw them. 3 wagons emerging from the trees, horses moving slow, their breath hissing in the cold. Men walked beside them, bundled in thick coats, rifles strapped to their backs. Not soldiers, not settlers headed home. Their coats were mismatched, their boots mismatched, their beards wild with frost. Drifters, maybe worse. Jonah squared his shoulders and stepped forward into the yard, boots crunching deliberate and slow. Snowflakes caught on his hat brim, melting down his cheek. The first wagon halted. A tall man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw lifted his chin. "You Jonah Hale?" he called, voice carrying hard across the cold. Jonah didn't answer immediately. "Depends," he finally said. "Who's asking?" The man's smile tilted, not friendly, not hostile, just sure of its own importance. "Name's Rusk. I'm looking for a woman." He took a step forward. A mail-order bride gone missing from Cedarford. Said she had 2 children with her. Marin's breath caught so sharply it hurt. Jonah's hand drifted toward the knife, sheathed under his coat. "Plenty of folks pass through winter," he replied calmly. "If you're tracking someone, you'll need better than a rumor." Rusk shrugged, unbothered. "Town clerk said a woman fitting her name left on a train headed north. Passenger saw her get off at Birch Hollow." His eyes swept across the clearing. "Little place like this. Hard to miss a new face." Jonah felt something cold settle behind his ribs, not fear, but the quiet burning of resolve. "And what business," he said, "does a stranger have hunting after a woman who chose a different life?" Rusk chuckled. "Choice? She was paid for, papers signed, man waiting, she's property now." Jonah's jaw tightened so sharply, Marin could see the muscle flex from the cabin doorway. "She's nobody's property," Jonah said. Rusk's grin widened. "Then we'll search your cabin and clear it up." Jonah stepped between them and the cabin door, like winter itself had anchored him to the spot. "You won't be doing that." A few of Rusk's men unslung their rifles, not raised, but ready. Inside the cabin, Thomas's voice quivered. "Ma, what will he do?" Marin's hands shook as she held her children close. "He'll protect us," she whispered. "He already decided that before he ever walked toward us." Outside, the wind blew harder now, swirling snow between Jonah and the strangers. The clearing tightened with tension, the air growing sharper, colder, like winter holding its breath. Rusk tilted his head, eyes narrowing. "You really want to stand between us and what we're owed?" Jonah didn't blink. "She's not owed," he said quietly. "She's safe." Rusk took one slow, deliberate step closer. "We'll see about that." The sun slipped behind a cloud then, and the cold deepened all at once. A drop so sudden it felt like the world itself was bracing for what would come next. Jonah shifted his stance. Maren gripped both her children tighter, her heartbeat pounding like a second fire in her chest. In the yard, the snow swirled in restless circles. A standoff was forming, a reckoning the winter had been waiting for. The clearing froze around them, not from the snow, but from something sharper, something tightening. Jonah stood alone in the open yard, the cabin at his back like a promise he refused to break. Rusk brushed frost from his coat, eyeing Jonah with the lazy confidence of a man who'd taken what he wanted his whole life and never paid for it. "Last chance," he said. "Step aside." "Step?" Jonah's breath curled slowly into the air. "No." For a moment neither man moved. Then Rusk nodded to one of his men. "Search the—" A sound cracked through the clearing. Not a gunshot, not a shout, just the sharp, deliberate cocking of a rifle from the cabin window. Thomas. The boy stood on a wooden stool, his small hands shaking around Jonah's old rifle, too heavy for him, too long for his arms, but lifted with a courage that did not belong to his age. Maren stood behind him, both hands wrapped around his shoulders, steadying him not out of fear, but out of something fiercer. Rusk's eyes narrowed. "Kid, you don't know how to—" "He doesn't have to," Jonah interrupted. "He just has to mean it." The men hesitated. Snow blew across their boots, swirling low like it was waiting for the next step. Rusk spat into the snow. "You're making trouble you can't finish, Hale." "Maybe," Jonah said, "but you're not taking them." Rusk looked toward the cabin again, toward the boy, the woman, the little girl peeking from behind her mother's skirt, eyes bright with fear but refusing to look away. Finally, he sighed, not defeated, but irritated. "There are easier families," he muttered. He waved his hand. The men lowered their rifles. Wheels groaned, horses tossed their heads as the wagons jerked forward. Slow at first, then steadier until the caravan disappeared back between the trees, swallowed by snow and shadow. Jonah didn't move until the last echo of wheels faded. Only then did he exhale. Only then did Maren lower the rifle from Tomas's hands. Jonah walked back toward the cabin, boots dragging slightly now. Not from injury, but from the weight that had just lifted from him so fast, it left him unsteady. When he opened the door, warmth rushed around him like an embrace he hadn't expected to earn. Maren stood with one hand on the table to steady herself. Thomas's chest rose and fell in quick, fierce breaths. Elsie reached for Jonah, and he scooped her into his arms without a second thought. "You all right?" he asked them softly. Maren nodded, though tears shimmered on her lashes. "You could have been killed." "So could you," he said. "I'd take that bargain every time." The fire crackled behind them. Snow hissed against the windows. Inside the small cabin, the world felt impossibly warm. Maren stepped closer, her voice barely more than breath. "Jonah, we didn't come here asking for more than safety." He looked at her, really looked, and something in his eyes softened into a quiet, deep certainty. "You'll have more than that," he said. "Not because of letters, not because of need, because this morning showed me something I thought I'd lost." Her heart thudded once, hard. "What's that?" she whispered. Jonah brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers warm despite the cold clinging to his coat. "A future." Outside winter howled, inside spring began.